Notre Dame had to upgrade its roster through the transfer portal this offseason, and I believe they did exactly that. New playmakers are in, key veterans are out, and we're breaking down the wins, losses, and what still needs to happen on today's Locked On Irish.
You are Locked On Irish, your daily podcast on the Notre Dame Fighting Irish, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome in. This is Locked On Irish, your daily Notre Dame podcast. My name is Wojciak, and I'm the host. I'm a Notre Dame alum and producer at Fox Sports. And happy Friday, everybody. Today is Friday, January 31st, and thanks for starting your day right here by making this your first listen of the day. Quick reminder to subscribe on YouTube if you're watching along, or if you're listening to Apple, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcast, remember to hit the subscribe button there as well. And today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. All right. The transfer portal window is officially closed for all teams across college football. And now that the dust has settled, we can evaluate whether Notre Dame was able to upgrade its roster going into next season, coming off their run to the national championship game. And that's what we're going to do on the show today. I'm going to start by breaking down who Notre Dame was able to add in the transfer portal and compare that to who is out the door. And then we're going to compare that to the biggest needs I had for this team going into this portal, this cycle. And then at the end, we'll look ahead to the spring window and see if Notre Dame has to make any additional moves, who could be out the door in that window. But we'll get to all that at the end. Let's start by looking at where Notre Dame was hit the hardest, and it was at offensive line and wide receiver in terms of guys who left the program. But when you look at these two positions, I think that there's two very different things going on. Let's start by looking at the wide receiver room, because yes, Notre Dame did lose Jaden Thomas and Deion Colzie, two great dudes by all accounts. Jaden Thomas was a leader on this team. He was always that guy that was breaking things down for the whole team right before they headed back to the locker room after warmups, and he's a big loss. There was one point in 2023 where it felt like Jaden Thomas was about to really take off. He was the wide receiver one with Sam Hartman at quarterback, and then he suffered that hamstring injury. It was never really the same that season. Then you go to 2024, and he was just in a crowded room. Notre Dame added three guys in the portal last year with Bo Collins, Chris Mitchell, and Jaden Harrison. Young guys like Jaden Greathouse and Jordan Faison. They were both starting to really ascend in the program as well. So that didn't really leave Jaden Thomas with a whole lot of reps. But when he had his opportunities, man, he made them count, and that dude was willing to get after it as a blocker, and I'm sure Notre Dame would love to have him on the team next season. But now Thomas is headed to Virginia, and even though it's unfortunate, he wouldn't have been probably in the top 5 wide receivers next year because Notre Dame was able to add Malachi Fields, also from Virginia. So it's kind of funny how that one-to-one trade works. Like, hey, Virginia, we're going to take Malachi Fields, the best receiver you had, the most consistent wide receiver of the past 2 years, had over 800 receiving yards back-to-back seasons. That trade, Malachi Fields to Jaden Thomas, I think Notre Dame won that trade going away, even though Notre Dame would have loved to have Jaden Thomas on the team next year. And Deion Colzie, a guy who, by all accounts, great person for the locker room and all that, he's headed to Miami of Ohio, and I think he's probably going to get a lot more reps there than he would at Notre Dame because he barely played at Notre Dame this season. Credit to him for sticking around. He could have left multiple times throughout his Notre Dame career, and he waited until now. He has his degree, so best of luck to both those guys in their next venture. But with Malachi Fields and Will Pauling, the wide receiver from Wisconsin, in the fold, I think this is a clear upgrade for Notre Dame at wide receiver. Malachi is going to be a day one starter at the boundary. I think he's probably the best all-around boundary wide receiver that Notre Dame has had since Chase Claypool. I don't think he's going to be as good as Chase Claypool, but still, that's a really good player to add in the room, and he's definitely better than any of the wide receivers that Notre Dame added last year. Will Pauling is an interesting case because he's a slot receiver. Notre Dame already has Jaden Greathouse. Jordan Faison can play the slot. Logan Soldate might emerge in the slot next year as well. But Will Pauling was pretty solid at Wisconsin. He played under Mike Brown, and that's where he had his best season with the Badgers. So I think he's going to be a good player on short yard situations, some guys, a guy who can move the sticks, things like that. So even though Notre Dame lost 2, I think they definitely upgraded with the 2 that they added. Now let's look at the offensive line because Notre Dame was hit pretty hard here. They lost Pat Coogan and Rocco Spindler, 2 guys who started a lot of games in their careers at Notre Dame, and then they also lost Sam Pendleton, who started the first 7 games of this season, in Ty Chan. Ty Chan was never going to play on this Notre Dame team next year, so it's not surprising that he's gone. He ended up with the UConn Huskies. But losing Pat Coogan and Rocco Spindler, that stings, man. I was hopeful that Pat Coogan would have stayed because Notre Dame might need a center at the start of next year, depending on how Ashton Craig recovers from his ACL injury. It sounds like he's going to be ready to go, but I'm just going to be a little bit skeptical about all these knee injuries that Notre Dame was dealing with last season and how those guys are going to be ready for next season, because all offseason we heard that Mitchell Evans was ahead of schedule and he was going to be ready to go by the start of the year. And then it just never really worked out that way for Mitchell Evans. He never really looked to be at full strength up until like the end of the season. Honestly, not until the Florida State game in November. That's when he really started to come on, but we're kind of waiting for that. And I'm worried that could happen with guys like Ashton Craig, Boubacar Traore, Jordan Botelho, but we'll see what happens, right? Not all injuries are the same, but still, Notre Dame definitely would have liked to have had Pat Coogan there. So if Ashton Craig is not ready to go at the start of the season, Pat Coogan could have been there to start, but I also understand why Pat Coogan didn't want to stick around and wait to maybe play at the beginning of the year, because even though Coogan, Spindler, and Pendleton have all started at Notre Dame, none of them are expected to start next year. If you look at what Notre Dame has coming back at tackle, Charles Jagasaw could play left tackle. He was projected to start there before the season until he had his torn pec injury in fall camp. Anthony Knapp ended up starting at left tackle in his place all year long, and he did really well as a true freshman. I mean, sure, he had his lumps along the way, but for a true freshman starting at left tackle, like, he did a really, really good job. And Emil Wagner, who a lot of people, myself included, had questions about going into the season, was really strong at right tackle all year long. And Jamie Uyeyama from Irish Sports Daily did a great breakdown of how Emil Wagner fared against Jack Sawyer on Ohio State in the national championship. And Wagner won a lot more than he lost going up against Jack Sawyer. And I think that tells you just how good of a player he is. And yeah, he lost several times against Abdul Carter in that game against Penn State, but Abdul Carter could be the number 1 overall pick in next year's draft. So I'm really excited about whoever Notre Dame plays at tackle next year, because if it's not Jagasaw or Knapp, it could be Gerby Lambert, who's going to be entering his second season with the program. He'll be a redshirt freshman next year. John Bryce from Irish Sports Daily raves about this dude, thinks he's a future NFL first-round pick. So they've got plenty of options at tackle. And then at guard, they've got Billy Shrouth, who might be the best overall lineman. Charles Jagasaw could also shift over to guard as well. We saw him play guard against Penn State. Anthony Knapp could also move inside. And then Sullivan Absher is a guy that the Notre Dame staff is really high on. And at center, they got Ashton Craig coming back, or maybe Anthony Knapp moves there. But either way, when you look at all these different combinations, this is something that we're going to be talking about all off season long. There's no clear path for Coogan, Spindler, or Pendleton to start. And I think that the most likely lineup, at least right now, again, this is subject to change, is probably either Anthony Knapp or Charles Jagasaw at left tackle, or maybe even Gerby Lambert, and then left guard Billy Shrouth, Ashton Craig, and then that right guard spot is basically going to be the odd man out at left tackle. I think it's going to end up being Charles Jagasaw, not that he's the odd man out. I just think he's better suited to play guard. So it's going to be, I think, either Knapp or Lambert at left tackle, Billy Shrouth at left guard, Ashton Craig at center, Charles Jagasaw at right guard, and then Emil Wagner at right tackle. And that is a phenomenal offensive line. Would have been nice for those guys to stick around? Absolutely. But Notre Dame is going to have one of the best offensive lines in the country next year, regardless. And then you look at the defense. Notre Dame didn't lose anyone on the defensive side of the ball in this window. I mean, I guess Jane Mickey left the team after game 4, but they did just fine in the secondary without him. And they're adding Devontae Smith, a player from Alabama who is going to be awesome at nickel. Like, Alabama was really upset that Devontae Smith was leaving. So the fact that Notre Dame is now getting starting defensive backs from Alabama, that tells you where the program is at these days. And Notre Dame has done really well at nickel with Jordan Clark and Thomas Harper. Those are 2 guys they added in the transfer portal. I think that Devontae Smith is going to be better than both of them. So that's going to be a great addition to Christian Gray and Leonard Moore on the outside. Like, that trio of cornerbacks, that's probably going to be Notre Dame's base defense next year, the nickel. Like, that is a really, really good group. And yes, they lose Xavier Watts at safety, and he is irreplaceable for sure. I mean, All-American at Notre Dame. I think he's going to go down as one of, if not the greatest safeties ever at Notre Dame. He certainly had one of the most prolific careers. They added Jalen Stroman from Virginia Tech, and even though he didn't play basically at all last year while he was recovering from an injury, this dude has NFL potential, and if he's able to stay healthy, that combination of him and Adon Schuler, who's going to be in his 3rd season with Notre Dame, like, that is just going to be one of the best defensive backs, one of the best secondaries in the entire country. When you look at Leonard Moore, Christian Gray, Devontae Smith, Jalen Stroman, and Adon Schuler, or maybe, Luke Talich or one of those younger guys in the Notre Dame roster, if they're able to excel. Either way, there's going to be plenty of depth in that secondary. And then on the defensive line, the biggest need going into the cycle, Jared Dawson from Louisville, day 1 starter. I mentioned this before on the show. I talked to Mike Rutherford of the Card Chronicle. He's my guy. He's been on the show a few times. He's probably my favorite Louisville personality, the one who I trust the most when it comes to the Louisville Cardinals. And he said he is immensely talented, and that was a big loss for the program. He was literally dominant at some points during the second half of the season for Louisville. He's going to be a sixth-year guy for Notre Dame next year, and he is a much-needed piece on the defensive line. They also added Elijah Hughes from USC. I think he's more of a depth piece, but someone that Notre Dame certainly needed because you need a lot of depth on the defensive line, and Notre Dame was decimated on that unit at the end of the year. They still were able to figure out a way to make it to the national championship, but then in that game, you saw the fact that they just didn't have enough guys to go up against Ohio State, and that's a big reason why Ohio State was able to run the ball. And then I have to mention, of course, Noah Burnett, the kicker. We saw how valuable Mitch Sheeter was for the team in the playoffs, even though he missed that kick in the national championship. He's the reason they were in that game because he made the game winner against Penn State. So, yeah, Notre Dame lost some key guys. Losing Coogan, losing Spindler, those are tough blows. But when you look across college football, man, teams lose starters. They lose players that they don't want to lose all the time. And when you look at what Notre Dame lost, a position at offensive line, like they were more than able to recover from that. And then at wide receiver, they upgraded. Everywhere else, it was an upgrade. So, yeah, it was a bummer losing those guys, but I think Notre Dame clearly upgraded in the transfer portal when you look at who they added compared to who they lost. So Notre Dame came into this portal cycle and they made key moves right away, but were they the right moves? So coming up next, we're going to take a step back and look at the bigger picture to see if the Irish were able to accomplish all their goals that they had going into the cycle. Today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Attending NFL playoff games is an experience like no other. The energy, the excitement, and the connection with other fans is unmatched. I remember the thrill of seeing my favorite team clinch a playoff win live, and it is a memory that I'll never forget. This year, Gametime makes it even easier to create those unforgettable moments with their new feature, Gametime Picks. It filters out the fluff and shows you only the best deals on great seats so you can focus on what matters, being there. I used Gametime Picks to grab tickets for an upcoming playoff game, and it could not have been easier. I found a super deal that gave me incredible value for amazing seats, and I could even preview the view from my spot before buying. The all-in pricing is a game changer. No surprise fees at checkout, plus knowing my tickets are backed by the Gametime guarantee gave me complete peace of mind. And their curated deals make it easier to find the best price on great seats. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last-minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. So even though I think it's clear that Notre Dame was able to add more than they lost, that doesn't tell the full story, right? Because Notre Dame had some clear needs coming into the transfer portal this cycle. So now let's evaluate how those additions compared to what they needed going into it. So the main thing that I've been talking about, that pretty much everyone has been talking about, is defensive tackle. I felt like they needed at least 3 guys at defensive tackle in the transfer portal, including 2 starters. So they added 2 guys, Jared Dawson and Elijah Hughes. They didn't lose anyone, which is good. And there are reports that Jason Onye, who left the team for personal reasons this past season, might be back on the team next year. He was listed on the roster, although I don't put too much stock into that just yet. I think he has a long way to go to work his way back on the team. But obviously, if he does join the team, that'd be more than welcome because Notre Dame certainly could have used him at the end of the year. He was starting to really ascend back in September, and then he had to step away for reasons that are unknown to us. And I know that a lot of people continue to ask. I'm just not going to give you the answer because I don't know the full story. And if it's personal, I'm going to leave it up to him. But anyway, let's get back to the transfer portal. So Notre Dame adds Dawson. I already raved about him. I think he's going to be really, really good for Notre Dame. And they added Elijah Hughes. Good for depth, but I think they still need at least 1 or 2 more guys at defensive tackle. And that's something they can address in the spring. We'll get to that in a second. But still, the fact that they were able to get 2 guys who both can contribute on the team next year is certainly a step in the right direction at the position of the biggest need going into it. Wide receiver. That was my second biggest need. They got 2 guys who are going to contribute next season and 1 guaranteed starter in Malachi Fields. Now, with Malachi, even though he's been highly productive at Virginia the past 2 seasons, he is probably going to have some sort of surgery this offseason. That is going to be something to monitor, but either way, he is not going to be able to participate in spring practice because he still has to graduate from Virginia. It's kind of like Bo Collins last year where he was on the team, but he was still taking classes at Clemson. I think that he was actually taking them online, but he could not practiced with the Irish during spring practice. He joined them full-time starting during summer workouts and then really took off during camp, but still his play was a little bit too inconsistent this past year. Notre Dame's certainly looking for more from Malachi Fields. If he's healthy and ready to go by the time the summer starts, that's certainly a good thing for Notre Dame because they need that true boundary wide receiver, that guy who can go out and make contested catches because that is someone they really missed. Jaden Greathouse and Jordan Faison really started to play well during the playoff, but they aren't the type of big body wide receivers that Notre Dame needs at the boundary. Malachi Fields certainly checks that box. Will Pauling, veteran, savvy guy who can make catches, get first downs. So they satisfied that need. I don't think they need to make any more moves at wide receiver. My third biggest need was nickel. They needed one, they needed a starter, and they got Devontae Smith. So big win there. He fills that need immediately. He was actually the first player in this cycle to announce his commitment to Notre Dame, and it was kind of odd timing because Notre Dame had not even played Indiana yet, and all the reports were that Notre Dame was trying to keep all their transfer portal moves quiet, to keep all the focus on the playoffs, but then the Devontae Smith news just kind of happened, and then the rest of it sort of poured in after that. But Notre Dame definitely got what they needed at nickel. Fourth need I had for Notre Dame was kicker. They got it. Noah Burnett, the kicker from North Carolina. Now, he has been a little bit inconsistent. Last year, his stats took a dip. He was only a 70% field goal kicker, but before the year prior to that, he was really accurate. So we know that he's got it in him, and it's going to be on Marty Biaggi to get the most consistent version of him this season. And even though Mitch Jeter had some big kicks for the Irish this past season, was really clutch for them against Indiana, Georgia, and Penn State, the fact that they just didn't have a field goal kicker during the second half of the season was rough. Now, I don't really blame Jeter. He was just hurt, but hopefully they have a little bit better luck on the injury front with kicker and at all other positions because, as you know, it was a really tough year for Notre Dame on the injury report. So hopefully Noah Burnett is able to capture some of that Money Mitch magic next year because they're going to need him if they make it back to the college football playoffs. Okay, the fifth biggest need I had was defensive end. I think they needed to add one, and they did not add any in the winter cycle. They might find one in the spring. I don't know. It's just really tough to find a high-quality defensive end. Notre Dame was able to get one a couple years ago in Javonte Jean-Baptiste. They thought they were going to have a big-time playmaker in R.J. Oben. It did not work out that way throughout the regular season, but then he came up with one of the biggest plays of the entire season with his strip sack against Georgia. I was hoping that Notre Dame would get another piece like a JJB, but those don't grow on trees, and if they are in the transfer portal, they're extremely expensive, and every single school in the country wants a player of that caliber at that position. I think Notre Dame is going to continue looking for another player on the edge, but they do have guys coming back. Like, if Boubacar Traore and Jordan Battel are healthy, then this really isn't a position of need, but as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to be a little bit skeptical about their health, and I'm going to bring it up all offseason. I've had some people already push back on that a little bit, but until I see him, until I see number 5, full go on the field, I'm going to have my doubts. But for Notre Dame's sake, we all hope that they're going to be ready to go by the start of next season. Either way, adding good players on the edge is always a good thing. And we saw what happened this past year. Junior Tui Alamaka, start of the year, number 3 Viper on the depth chart. Ended up having a huge role for the team, and I think that he's going to be even more confident and ready to go next season now that he has this year under his belt. At number 6, I had safety. They needed one. They got one, Jalen Stroman. Now, there are concerns about his injury history, of course, and as I mentioned before, when he committed to Notre Dame, he's also had some issues staying on the field because he's had a few targeting penalties in the past. Well, Notre Dame is going to have to clean that up, and Chris Ash, one positive thing that he's known for is his rugby tackling. He brought that to Ohio State and improved tackling across the board. Notre Dame has been excellent at tackling under Al Golden. We'll see if that's able to continue under Chris Ash, but they got their guy they needed at safety, and there are some young guys who are probably poised to get on the field. I mentioned Luke Talich in the previous segment. Kennedy Urlacher flashed against Purdue. Now, granted, I probably could have flashed against Purdue, and so could you, because they were just that bad, but I think that Kennedy Urlacher is a playmaker. Notre Dame's veteran defensive backs raved about him during fall camp, and even though he didn't do much on the field other than special teams, he's Brian Urlacher's kid. Like, I'm going to have some confidence he can make some plays for the Notre Dame defense next year. So we're going to have to wait and see. Tight end is interesting. So that's next for me. I had that at 7. I said they needed one. They got one in Ty Washington, but then Cooper Flanagan ruptured his Achilles in that Georgia game. And I'm actually kind of surprised that's not really being talked about that much. I think it's because Notre Dame hasn't officially announced it's a torn Achilles, but that's what I believe it is. That's what I've heard it is. So if that's the case, he's out all of next season. And they already lose Mitchell Evans because he's out of eligibility. So that leaves Eli Raridan, That leaves Jack Larson, who's a freshman, didn't play at all this year. And then they have Jack Flanagan coming in, the true freshman. And they have Ty Washington, the transfer from Arkansas. Washington is a really good blocker, but I think they actually might need one more tight end. And that's kind of weird for Notre Dame that they would have to go out and get 2 tight ends in the transfer portal because they're basically tight end you. But I really think they're going to have to do it. Now, maybe Cooper Flanagan got a second opinion and it isn't a ruptured Achilles, but I don't expect to see Cooper Flanagan on the field next year. And that depth in that room is pretty thin right now. Like, this is the only season that Eli Raiden was able to play through beginning 10. And even though I think he's got all the physical tools, that's just a concerning situation in the tight end room. So they got one. They might end up needing one more. I said they need a backup unless nobody transferred. So far, no one has transferred a quarterback, so I don't think they need to get a quarterback right now. That is for sure. And then I said quarterback, linebacker, running back, and O-line, not necessary. O-line has changed a little bit, right, because they lost 4 guys. I still think they're fine. I don't think they need to go out and get an offensive lineman in the transfer portal. So did they accomplish their goals in the transfer portal? I think they did. I wouldn't give them like an A-plus grade, but I would give them like A-minus, B-plus. They would get to that A-plus range or that A range if they're able to get one more starter at defensive tackle. But I loved what they brought in at wide receiver. I love what they brought in the secondary with Devontae Smith and Jalen Stroman. They got a kicker. They got one tight end. And we're going to have to wait and see what happens. But I feel like overall, you look at what Notre Dame brought in. I already said they added more than they lost. That's great. But did they satisfy all their needs? I think they're really damn close. They're really damn close. The good thing is there is a spring window still to go. So even though this portal window is closed, we're going to see some more movement a few months from now when the spring window opens again. So coming up next, we're going to break down what the Irish still need to address on the roster. Stick around. So traditionally, Notre Dame has done pretty much all of their work in the transfer portal during the winter cycle, but that doesn't mean there aren't some good players out there. You think back a couple years ago, Notre Dame lost Tyler Buckner and Logan Diggs to the spring window, and I think now they're probably going to have to be a little bit more active in this spring window than they have been in the past. So one thing right off the bat, they need another defensive tackle. I don't know if they're going to find one because there are far less players who enter the spring window compared to the winter one, but they're certainly going to be in the market for one because they need depth at that position. I already talked about tight end. They need another guy. They need another body. I don't think they're going to go out there and get a starter. I think they have a lot of faith in Eli Raiden and what he can do for the team going forward. But, with Kevin Bauman's future pretty uncertain right now. Maybe he's just done with football. He really wasn't a factor this season. He has dealt with a litany of injuries throughout his career. I think they could use another tight end as well. And they also don't really know what's going to happen at quarterback. It is going to be the biggest storyline of the offseason. I'm sure I'm going to spend countless episodes talking about who the starting quarterback will be for Notre Dame at the start of next season. When Notre Dame takes the field against Miami, it's going to be another new starting quarterback. And they've had to break in one-year starters 3 of the past 4 years via the transfer portal with Riley Leonard, Sam Hartman, and then Jack Cohn in 2021. It's just going to be a really interesting situation for Notre Dame at quarterback. But to my surprise, everyone came back. Again, Steve Angeli, Kenny Minchey, CJ Carr, they're all on the roster. They're all ready to battle it out in the spring. And it's going to be a really fun battle. Like, Steve Angeli probably is in the driver's seat right now, at least for spring because he's the veteran. But CJ Carr, man, everyone has been raving about him. And even though he really couldn't even throw a ball throughout most of the fall because he was dealing with a lingering elbow injury, the way that people talk about him, man, they think that he's going to really take this football program and he's going to take the reins as the starting quarterback and he could win it as a redshirt freshman. I still need to see it to believe it. And then you got Kenny Minchey, who's, I don't know why he's like so dismissed by so many people. Every time I see him throw the ball, it looks awesome. Now, obviously, there's a lot more that goes into playing quarterback than just your arm talent, but he throws a really beautiful ball, and I thought what he did in the blue and gold game was really encouraging, specifically his ability to run the ball. So that competition, someone is going to leave after the spring. It's inevitable. There is no way. I would bet $1 million that Steve Angeli, Kenny Minchey, and CJ Carr are not all on the roster when Notre Dame starts fall camp. And if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. And if I'm wrong, that's great for Notre Dame because they have 3 really solid options at quarterback. So I do expect one to leave. That wouldn't be a huge deal. If, let's say they somehow convince Steve Angeli to stay, but CJ Carr is probably going to be the starter and Kenny Minchey leaves. It'd be disappointing, obviously, right? Because I think that there is some talent there. But if you have a quarterback room with Steve Angeli, CJ Carr, and then you got the true freshman Blake Hebert, I think they're solid there, right? That's enough guys in the room. But beyond that, I feel like there's potentially going to be some more movement at Notre Dame. I think there's going to be a lot of attrition at the very bottom of the roster, like maybe a Brennan Vernon or a Devin Houston, one of those guys leaves, or like kind of in the Ty Chan caliber, right? Guys who are big-time recruits coming out of high school that it just didn't really pan out for them at Notre Dame. Like I could see some movement there. But Notre Dame has done a really, really good job of retaining players. And I think, even though there was those couple days, right, when Notre Dame was like losing Pat Coogan, they were losing Rocco Spindler, and Al Golden, his move to Cincinnati became official. And it felt like it was just all this bad news hitting Notre Dame at once, just a few days after losing the national championship. Like it really wasn't fun at the time. But now that it's all over, you look at what Notre Dame is bringing back next year, and this team is going to be loaded. Sure, there are questions at quarterback. That's a big question. What is the defensive line going to look like at the start of next season? Definitely a question mark. But as I said earlier, this is going to be one of the best offensive lines in the country. They have one of the best running back rooms in all of college football. Jeremiah Love, Jadarian Price, Aeneas Williams, Keedron Young. Wide receiver, I think, is going to be a big upgrade over last season. On defense, that linebacker core, like there were a lot of reports that Jalen Snead could enter his name in the transfer portal. Notre Dame was able to retain him. Think about that 5-man rotation next year at linebacker. Jalen Snead, KVA, Drake Bowen, Jay Nosbury, and the true freshman, Matt Framo coming in. That is a very, very talented group. And I said Notre Dame could have one of the best secondaries in college football. So yeah, the losses sting when the announcements come out, and then you got to deal with, the other fan sites being like, Notre Dame is losing starters in the offensive line. Like, what's going on there in South Bend? And then you have to explain to them, like, no, these guys weren't going to start. And you look at what Notre Dame is bringing back, like, this is really, really good. And I thought for sure Notre Dame would lose at least one starter on both sides of the ball that they did not want to lose, and that really didn't happen. Because even though they didn't want to lose Pat Coogan or Rocco Spindler, those guys weren't going to be projected starters. The fact that in this modern era of college football, Notre Dame was able to retain all the guys that they did tells you how strong the culture is in that locker room under Mark Streeman. And it gives me plenty of reason to be excited about the future. Like, yeah, that sucked losing to Ohio State in the national championship. And who knows when Notre Dame is going to get back, because it is really, really hard to get back. But when you are able to inspire confidence and belief in your entire roster, and then when you have a need to fill and you can go out in the transfer portal and make that happen, I think the program is in a really, really great place. So I think Notre Dame clearly upgraded its roster in the transfer portal. And the stuff that isn't super newsy, like the fact that they were able to just retain guys, maybe I think I can say with pretty confidently that there were some guys who were big contributors for Notre Dame this past season that at least entertained the thought of entering the transfer portal, but Notre Dame was able to retain them. Maybe there were some additional NIL increases, as there should when you make a run to the national championship, but Notre Dame was able to weather all those storms for the most part, and they bring back a loaded roster for next season. And the big reason why is because of what they did in the transfer portal this offseason. But that's a wrap for this episode. That'll do it for this week of Locked On Irish. And even though it's the offseason, we have still got plenty of content coming your way. Next Monday, Luke Smith and I are going to do our annual postseason award show. We have to do it much later than normal this time around. I can't believe we had to wait till February to do it, but that's what happens when you make it to the national championship in this new format. This episode is always a ton of fun. It is a great way to look back on all the best moments of the season, and it's honestly one of my favorite shows of the year. So you are not going to want to miss that. That is coming your way on Monday, and to ensure that you never miss an episode, you should subscribe on YouTube or wherever you're listening to the podcast if you have not done so already. And if you enjoyed the show today, please give this video a like if you're watching along on YouTube, or rate the podcast 5 stars and leave a review on your preferred platform. And have a great weekend, everybody. I'll see you on Monday.